Welcome to this Conveyancing Matters October 2022 news chat. Welcome to Conveyancing Matters with Lorraine and Stu. Join us for a chat about all things property. So, Stu, hello, how are you?
I'm good, Lorraine. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks, lovely. So, unbelievably, we've already reached our news chat, our monthly news chat for October 2022, Stu. And of course, I think the biggest piece of news inevitably is Conveyancing Matters Live on the 8th of November. What are we going to talk about?
Of course it is, yeah. So we're at the Hoxton 7 again, aren't we? We're going to be talking about inquiries. So what to raise, what's relevant, any funny ones,
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, there is still time for people to book if they want to join us. How many CPD events can you go to with a beer in your hand underneath a glitter ball? I would suggest one.
Not many.
And it would be hours. So it would be great to see people there. And actually, we're not going to put out a recording of it afterwards. So if you want to come along, then you're going to have to book a ticket. But anyway, Stu, on to other news. There is other news apart from Conveyancing Matters Live. So what sort of things have caught your eye this month?
So I suppose, bearing in mind we're not that far away, we've got the Land Registry's sort of deadline coming up for digital applications.
Yeah, what's the deadline date, Stu?
It's the 30th of November. So we're getting there, aren't we? Not long now.
Not far away at all. So the date when the Land Reg are effectively going to stop receiving applications sort of uploaded, PDFs uploaded via the portal. They're not going to accept scanned copies anymore, and it's going to be necessary to sort of use their digital registration service. I mean, surely your firms must be on board with that now, Stu, do you think?
You would have thought so, wouldn't you? You would have thought so. Yeah, I can't see it being much of a problem for firms. Been a bit of a soft launch into it, hasn't there? So everyone should be well versed now as to what they need to do.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Land Reg certainly when they trialled it said it resulted in something like 25% fewer requisitions because it's a digital system. I think it doesn't let you go on to the next stage if you got something wrong the previous one. So if you've got a title number wrong or something, so I think it is weeding out a lot of errors. So good on them for that. I mean, hopefully it will mean that their resources can be perhaps put into their their TP1s and their leases, Stu, because there's still ridiculous delays there.
Yeah, I mean, it's still causing firms a lot of problems, the delays, particularly on new builds. Something that, does need to be tackled, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a great fan of the Land Reg, but I think I've probably said this before because I'm nothing if not dull and repetitive, Stu, but I am still slightly baffled at the amount of resource they're pouring into something like the Local Land Charges project when actually, I think they should be sort of sorting out their main priorities first, if I'm really honest, rather than just sort of, doing, well, excuse the metaphorical joke, a bit of a land grab for other things. Personally, I think their resources ought to be going into the reason they were set up, that's concluding registrations, because their own data is still saying, Stu, that I think as of August, their data was saying that, first registrations, as you say, new leases, new builds are still taking, at least a year, which I think by any standards is pretty unacceptable, isn't it?
It is, and it's difficult to really communicate that to a client, that it would take that long. Yeah. And of course, from our position, it's even worse when, a client might have a friend down the pub that has their registration done in a month or 2 months. Yet somebody buying a new build, it takes a lot longer. And even some of the new builds, it seems to be no rationale in terms of, some will take forever and some go through a lot quicker. I think it depends more who you get doing your application there rather than the application itself. So it's a difficult one, I think, for all firms.
Do you sort of manage clients' expectation in your standard letters too, and sort of before exchange say to your client on a new build, for example, look, this registration could take a year. So if you want to sell or remortgage in that time, that could cause you difficulties.
We have to. So we have to document that prior to exchange and on completion. But I'm not sure that information's fully, taken on board by a client and digested, because of course at the time they've just bought the property, they're not thinking that they might be selling it quickly or, they might be, refinancing it anytime soon. So I'm not sure it's something a client can fully comprehend at that point. So it's a difficult one for us, that.
Yeah, no, I agree. Well, moving on, Stu, the Register of Overseas Entities. I mean, I thought it was worth mentioning. I might, probably you and I might put out a bit more on this, another day. But really, just to remind firms, because I certainly have seen now that the Land Reg is sort of certainly starting to sort of send letters to organisations. So, in brief, the Register of Overseas Entities came into force on the 1st of August 2022 through the Economic Crime Transparency and Enforcement Act, and essentially basically overseas entities that want to buy, sell or transfer property or land in the UK have got to register with Companies House first and give details of the registrable beneficial owners. They then get, once that's done, an overseas entity ID, which then has to be submitted to the Land Reg on a registration. But the thing is, there is a retrospective bit here, and I think that's the point, and that's what I think firms just perhaps need to be braced for companies crawling out the woodwork for whom they've acted where the companies do have an overseas element, because, as I say, the Act does apply retrospectively. So overseas entities that bought property or land, in fact, on or after the 1st of Jan 1999 in England and Wales and 8th of December 2014 in Scotland, are going to have to register and tell Companies House about the beneficial owners by 31st of Jan 2023. Now, I'm not suggesting that firms might do too much about that right now. If a client file is sort of closed and finished, I don't think firms are going to go sort of trawling back through their databases to see what companies might have, they might have acted for since 1999, to which the rules might apply to. But I'm afraid the old cynic in me can see that, if a company does fall foul of these rules, even if the firm had nothing to do with them, has had nothing to do with them for years, I can still see, in the news this time next year or in the conveyancing news, companies trying to have a proper, pop at their conveyancer for not having a crystal ball. I don't know what you think, Stu, but
look, I mean, it's one of those, isn't it? There has to be a commercial line that you draw on it, and you can't go back for all your archive files and bring everything up again, especially as this is only something that's just coming into the arena now, isn't it? You, like you say, the crystal ball. We couldn't have foresaw that coming in, and therefore, nothing we can do about it.
Yeah, but I think there's also an element of, well, that applies to us. Why didn't you tell us? Well, actually, because you're not a current client anymore. Yeah. I think what firms need to do is have an awareness.
Your retain has been concluded by that point, hasn't it?
Yeah, but as well as I do, the complaints ambit against us, the properly insured, Stu, is ever widening. And I'm sure an ombudsman somewhere is going to,
That's the problem. You would hope, wouldn't you, that you'd look at something that was, previous to the, what's coming in and think, well, you couldn't really uphold that. But you never know these days, do you?
No. And it's clearly not going to be something that applies to lots of firms, because if there's most of us don't act for companies where there are overseas, elements involved. I mean, just a couple of practical observations I would have. Clearly, those firms that regularly act for companies where there are registrable beneficial owners, that and what an overseas entity is obviously defined in the Act. Those firms are going to be used to it and will start dealing with it, and it's not going to be a problem for them. I always think actually the risk for firms is those matters that where it doesn't happen very often. Yeah. So I just think it's important that firms have an awareness of that. I do think it's really, really important that firms are therefore all over the beneficial owner requirements when they are acting for limited companies, because that's how they're going to find out about overseas entities. And I do think it's worth pointing out that actually the sort of AML due diligence requirements that firms have in relation to affected companies are sort of somewhat different to the Register of Overseas Entities requirement. So I think it could be a bit of a black hole for firms if they're not careful, and really just to alert firms to the fact that actually The Law Society has now put out some useful guidance on it, and actually Companies House has also punted out a fair old bit of guidance. And I think there's an element of forewarned is forearmed. I think it's something
it's a niche area, though, isn't it? It's a niche area. I'm not sure many practices would dabble.
Yeah, I agree, but I think the point is, it's not necessarily that you dabble; it's that you might not notice, Stu.
Yeah, of course.
It's being forewarned is forearmed, isn't it? If you don't know what you're looking for, you're not going to know it when you see it.
No, true.
So I think that's the point, isn't it? If you don't make enough inquiry about who is behind a limited company, or where it's based, or what it does, etc., etc., or if you get an inquiry from a limited company that you acted for on a purchase in 2002, saying does this apply to us? Well, if you don't know, you're not going to know that it's an issue. So from with my training hat on, I mean, it sounds a bit odd, but I'm a big fan of trying to know what you don't know. In a sense, it's the awareness thing, isn't it? Whereas if you just blithely, because there are significant penalties for the advisors involved as well, needless to say. Firms need to watch out for it, I think. What would be next in the news list, Stu?
One of the things I was going to bring up was powers of attorney. We loosely discussed them as a general, didn't we, before we came on air? And there seems to be, as we move forward with powers of attorney, a difference of opinion on what's acceptable and what's not. And it amazes me that there are still the old-fashioned sort of powers of attorney floating around on bits of paper. And if there's ever there was a fraud waiting to happen, you'd have thought a power of attorney is a real easy one to do now. But I know the Land Registry have recently updated their sort of procedures and what they will accept in terms of document being certified, haven't they?
Yeah, they've updated Practice Guide 9, and it seems like a small update. And I think it was originally a temporary sort of COVID update that appears to now have been sort of enshrined as what looks like a permanent update now, as during Practice Guide 9, where they will now accept, and it's, of course, it makes perfect sense, but they will accept a copy power of attorney that's been certified by a chartered legal exec, which, frankly, why wouldn't they? It makes perfect sense that given that professional qualification that they do. I just think on a broader power of attorney point, I think firms still need to think quite carefully about, about, for example, submitting powers of attorney to the Land Reg. I think you should really probably ask for dare I say, a hard copy power of attorney that's been certified, on each page properly in a wet ink signature. If you're acting for the buyer, I think you should probably keep hold of that certified copy until your registration is complete. And of course, ask if you're acting for the buyer, ask the seller's conveyancer to confirm that they've ID'd the attorney, as well as the legal owner.
I think there's a lot more to powers of attorney than we sometimes give it credit. I mean,
there's loads.
And maybe we'll do another chat on this, another day. But if you're dealing with, a transaction where powers of attorney is involved, do conveyances, for example, make an inquiry before we exchange it, the person's still alive. The person giving the power, because you might have a scenario where the power's been given on health reasons, because potentially they're dying. What happens if they die?
Well, I had that very thing when I was locuming.
Of course, it's not valid, is it?
I think that, yeah, exactly. And there's a massive misunderstanding, actually.
Yeah.
Frankly, dare I say, by conveyancers about the status of powers of attorney. So I think we have just talked our way into a chat about that. But I'll tell you what, I've got a bit of a tester here, a bit of a market tester here, Stu. So we're going to put out there on this news bulletin that we're going to do some guff on powers of attorney. Shall we see if anybody else picks it up and does it as well, Stu?
Maybe.
Yeah, let's just see, shall we? Well, moving on then, Stu, again, I do think it's useful for sort of CRC regulated firms to keep an eye on what the Law Society is putting out and vice versa. And really no more than a full information. Conveyancers might be interested to know that the Law Soc has put out some guidance, a blockchain report, which they've put out in collaboration with a couple of with the Tech London Advocates Blockchain Legal and Regulatory Group. That's a bit of a mouthful, but basically what it does, for the sort of technophobes like me, it defines distributed ledger technology. It sort of gives you more information about kind of what blockchain is. I think it's just a useful, explainer for firms. And of course, it kind of leads slightly into the sort of broader issue around, and you see it mentioned a fair old bit on social media, don't you? Issues around sort of cryptocurrency, and should conveyancers be, accepting, cryptocurrency as a means to fund a purchase. And I think the the compliance consensus is, well, you can't be the source of funds on it, so no. But really, just to kind of mention that guidance is out there. Any comments or observations, Stu, particularly before I move on?
No, it's just one of those, isn't it? It's, we're going down these roads, aren't we, of our industry sort of venturing outside what we know about, and it's becomes more and more difficult the more we talk about, or anything, doesn't matter what the subjects are. It seems to me that when we do these news pieces, it could be sort of climate reports, it could be blockchain and Bitcoin and all this sort of stuff. It's I think for anybody new coming into the industry, training, it's a never-ending. I think every day's a learning day now, isn't it, for us?
Well, thankfully for the likes of me, Stu. Yeah,
I was just going to say this. I was going to row you in there to give you a pitch.
I think the problem is, and that my broader issue, and it always has been, and I'm certainly a product of my age, and I'm certainly, I think probably officially old. I think just as a general sort of professional point, what bothers me, and I say it, pretty much every time I train, we are one of the only parties that are properly insured in this whole shooting match. And the further out, our responsibility for advising on all this perceived stuff creeps, just the bottom line is the more liability the conveyancers are taking on. And that's what really bothers me. Because conveyancers are going to get hit, and the lenders want us to advise on all this stuff and take responsibility for it. Who knew? I bet they do. And to me, quite why conveyancers aren't pushing back, quite why our professional bodies aren't, quite why we aren't trying to draw a much clearer line under our lines of responsibility and the expectations on us, I do find genuinely quite extraordinary. Because there won't be that many, more firms are frankly going to leave the market. And well, we can't get you're not going to be able to get professional indemnity insurance exponentially for all of these issues that conveyancers seem to be willing to accept we should be advising on. And I just think, cryptocurrency, all of that stuff, all the new stuff, and there are certainly firms right out there on the cutting edge that can, I'm sure, I know what they're talking about, but I think the vast majority of us don't. But anyway, and speaking of complaints, just a kind of brief one, really. And maybe your comments, Stu, on what the practical impact for firms. But the Legal Ombudsman is apparently changing its scheme rules from next April Fool's Day. Hilariously enough, 1st of April 2020.
All the days.
Yeah, why do people choose April Fool's Day to introduce stuff? I find it quite.
Probably 31st of March would have been a lot better.
Yeah, exactly. But essentially, the Ombudsman is looking to change its scheme rules to basically sort of tighten up on the cut-off dates in relation to complaints. So, if a complaint is going to be referred to the Legal Ombudsman by a client because it hasn't been, well, usually by a client, rather than Uncle Tom Cobley and everybody else, if the firm hasn't dealt with it adequately in the client or complainant's view, they're not going to be able to go to the Ombudsman, more than a year from the date of the act or omission being complained about, or 1 year from the date when the complainant should have realised there was cause for complaint. So essentially, it's a cut-off for complainants and members of the public for a year, which, I mean, hopefully is going to help firms. And frankly, the cynic in me says this might help the Ombudsman improve its outputs a bit, Stu. But from your perspective as a firm owner, what would be the sort of practical issues that you'd be thinking about?
Well, there's a number of things, isn't there? So first and foremost, your terms and conditions, obviously where we document, what happens with complaints and our policies and procedures, that needs to be changed. Our client care letter, obviously our our complaints procedure. And of course, all this is also documented on our website, so it needs to be changed on there too.
Yeah, so firms need to keep up on it, don't they? And I accept that, and I hate to say this, but the sort of perhaps the coal-faced conveyancer, as I might call them, perhaps, won't have the responsibility for updating this stuff, but they perhaps need to be sort of telling somebody, if they're watching this, telling somebody these changes are coming, so that,
or certainly make sure they might have the most up-to-date, firms complaints policy.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Stu, come on, you're a man at the cutting edge of the market. You know more than the rest of us, really, in terms of what's going on.
Say that, blimey.
Yeah. So, 3rd of November, we have the Bank of England interest rate rise. What's your view, Stu? That should be a new feature, shouldn't it? What's your view, Stu?
Well, it's my view would be probably no different to most people. We know this is coming, or we knew this was coming, didn't we? It's no surprise that it's gone up to 3%. And the impact on the market's obviously going to be significant. Whether prices drop, which is what people, general people talk about, I'm not sure. I'm not sure the drop would be significant, but I certainly think the volume of transactions is going to decrease, and that's not going to come to a surprise to anyone, is it? The volume of transactions is certainly going to decrease. To what extent? Who knows? And I certainly wouldn't want to talk us into a problem or recessions or market slumps and all this different terminology that people use. But I think everyone's going to be mindful that we've had 2-3 years of unbelievable volumes, and in terms of obtaining new work, let's be blunt, we've had it easy. We've not had it easy in terms of doing the work, obviously, but in terms of getting work in, that's the one thing that we have had easy, and we haven't had to make an effort. But I think now, sort of looking at that part of your business or your caseload is going to be vitally important, and managing what you do, where it comes from, your profit margins is going to be really crucial over the next, well, probably more than the next 6 months.
Yeah, I mean, the Bank of England has sort of, well, needless to say, predicted a recession. But I mean, mortgage rates are coming down a bit already, given that they spiked up after the 23rd of September. No budget. I mean, as you know, the CRC is certainly warning firms to expect a bit of a slowdown, and we're seeing reports that transaction numbers fell in October 2022. But to my mind, and maybe again, it's because you and I have now been through a couple of these, 2 or 3 of these cycles, really. I mean, the bottom line is interest rates couldn't stay at the level they were at indefinitely. That was always a historic low, which I think people forget.
But does everybody know that?
Well, I don't think they do. I think
because I think you've got to take into account,
bubbles, don't they?
Yeah, I think we all are in a bubble, and we've got to sort of maybe understand that the volume of transactions that we've all been doing has meant the volume of staff within the industry has gone through the roof. And of course, that's a lot of new people that have come into conveyancing and that maybe don't have experience from the last recession or ones before that. So we are in a bit of a bubble, aren't we? And I think this could come as a bit of a shock to a lot of people, I think.
Yeah, I'm thinking though maybe more of sort of law firm leaders who are, theoretically are, in a position to be or should have been sort of planning, thinking about this, heads of department, etc., senior partners, etc. It shouldn't be a shock to them. We were inevitably going to move from these historic low interest rates. Interest rates were going to go up and property prices were going to come down. That was always going to happen. And I just don't think that should come as a shock to people who should be dealing with the sort of strategic aspects of what's going on in a conveyancing department. But this is where, I'm always interested to see what, friend of the show, Russell Quirk has to say, because of course, Russ is quite bullish about this, and I admire him for being so, I have to say, because he does call out all this sort of terrible doom and gloom reporting, and sort of say, well, look, actually, sometimes what's being reported about the potential for, the backside to fall out the market, at the moment is cobblers. And of course, the problem is that, as you said, Stu, we do have to be careful about these things not becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. But I think in terms of strategy within conveyancing and strategy within law firms, interest rates up, property prices down, transaction numbers down, should not have come as a surprise to anybody.
No, I think there's two different parts to this, though. I think there's, a market crash. There's all this different terminology that people use like that. The devil's always in the detail, and there's a big difference between the price of property coming down and the volume of transactions coming down. The price of property reducing to us within the industry is not of great consequence, is it? It's the volume of transactions coming down. And the one thing that I never really fully understood before the last recession, sort of going back to 2008, was that things kind of paused, just stopped. So I always, had that sort of young, arrogant attitude that, if I sort of stopped getting work from A, I'd just go out and get it from B, or I'd go out and get it from this person, or I'd make myself busy, I'd get out there. But people, there is no work out there in a recession. People just stop. And I think sometimes you could talk about interest rates, inflation, the war in Russia, the cost of living, but it's that uncertainty, isn't it? And it's that uncertainty that panics people.
Yeah.
And, they may still move, and they, 100% will still move in the future. It's that they might just not do it now. And that sort of stop or that pause will see, transactions fall, and that's what will hurt law firms. Whether the prices go down significantly, whether they dip to 20%, 10%, or don't dip at all, you've got to be careful at what you're reading and what you're looking at.
Yeah, I agree. But of course, the funny old thing is actually, Stu, you're saying about, people won't move for a while. I think that's right. But of course, one of the things that, we were reporting on and talking about during the stamp duty land tax no holiday is that kind of people were moving that kind of didn't need to move, or perhaps didn't want to move, but felt that curious compunction to do it because of the so-called saving. But of course, in the reality, actually, what was probably happening is the prices were being pushed up sufficiently because of demand, that actually in the net result was they didn't make much saving. So in an odd sort of way, some of the pipeline for the next few months is inevitably been sort of squeezed into the last 2 years.
100%.
But anyway.
And that's why it was always the perfect storm, wasn't it?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's perhaps move on. Just a couple of perhaps of final points. As a trainer, I'm always reluctant to point out anybody else that's any good at it, but I have to say, the Land Reg does produce some really, really good training, free training products for conveyancers and their support staff. They've got webinars available on demand, and firms might be interested to know, and conveyancers might be interested to know, that they've got a bunch of new ones on all about how deeds should be signed, which actually is pretty important, because if a deed isn't signed properly, it's going to be rejected by the Land Reg for registration. So they've got webinars and sessions on, deeds being signed by individuals, companies, local authorities, overseas, powers of attorney. So I think we definitely are going to come back to that, Stu. But really, just as a bit of a flag for conveyancers, that those resources are out there and are relatively new from the Land Reg. And really, the kind of the final point I thought I would mention, just sort of in passing, really, the continuous running sword that is stamp duty land tax for conveyancing firms. Certainly CQS accredited firms have had the requirements sort of increased again by the core practice management standards. I know that doesn't affect CLC firms directly, and basically what CQS accredited firms do now have to do is kind of track the stamp duty land tax advice across the life of a transaction, and whether the stamp duty land tax is going to change as a result of information given to clients. Now, clearly, all firms should be doing that on their files, but I just thought, firms might be interested to know. And the chap hit the headlines because he was the founder of the Goo chocolate dessert. So we've all got the little ramekins in our cupboards. He's the man that's responsible for all the little glass ramekins, isn't he? That we think, oh, I'm going to have my Goo pudding, and I'm going to keep that little glass ramekin. And everybody's got a whole bunch of little glass ramekins in their cupboard that we never use. Well, it's him. So basically, what he tried to do, he bought a £3 million property. This is all out in the public domain, of course. He initially paid stamp duty land tax of over £250,000. On the base that the entire use was classed as residential. But of course, if there's an element of mixed use, that can bring the stamp duty land tax bill quite dramatically. And this, I thought, felt to me, and I'm not a stamp duty land tax advisor, but just as an observer, I have to say this felt a bit on the edge to me, metaphorically and literally, because he then tried to he claimed a refund and the land and the revenue. If you claim a stamp duty land tax refund, kind of, you know, pay it and then argue about it later. So he got a refund of a shade under 120k, Stu, arguing that a footpath skirting the edge of his property rendered it mixed use. And that was on the basis of you know, one of these stamp duty land tax sort of recovery companies helping you get your refund, and of course the revenue paid the refund. They argued about it later, and essentially it went to court, and the revenue won, and they sort of basically found that the footpath skirting the edge of a property did not render it mixed use. And funnily enough, Mr. Goo's now in the goo because he's been asked to pay his 120 grand's worth of stamp duty land tax. And I love the Land Registry's comment, the Revenue's comment, and I rarely say I love the Revenue, but they did rather dryly say, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. And it's just that thing for conveyancers more generally, Stu, isn't it? You know, we're generalists. If there's a doubt about the client's stamp duty land tax position, well, they've got to get, you know, detailed specialist advice prior to exchange.
It's literally as simple as that, isn't it?
Except it's not simple for conveyancers, is it? Because clients don't want to listen. They expect us to do it. They expect us to do the calculation. They're
don't put yourself, just don't put yourself on record. It's, you know, again, we've already covered this, haven't we, about things outside our remit. And this is one of those. You know, it's I know this is another conversation for another day, but the mere fact we're involved in stamp duty in the first place, and as you rightly said earlier, you know, be it our regulators or whoever hadn't pushed back on that point, is, to me, has always been insane.
Well, given how complex stamp duty land tax has become, you know, when it was stamp duty, that was, you know, not too difficult. But, you know, stamp duty land tax has become an extraordinary beast in the last 20 years. But,
that should be under the, you know, jurisdiction of an accountant who specialises in that subject field.
Of course it should. Of course it should.
But there you go.
Well, perhaps on that gooey subject, just to carry on my goo.
Come out with all the jokes today, aren't you?
Yeah, I think I really have squeezed those, haven't I? Well, I think that probably concludes our October 2022 news chat. I think it's fair to say, Stu, we found more to talk about than we thought we would. I'm really looking forward to Conveyancing Matters Live. I'm really looking forward to being in the same room as you, mate, with a couple of beers and the glitter ball. Definitely. So I will see you soon, and let's have some fun.
Definitely. All right. See you then. Take care. Bye.